During World War II, several tens of thousands of partisan detachments and underground resistance cells operated in the territory of the Soviet Union. Many of them were quite small, while others numbered several dozen people. One of the most famous in the USSR in the history of the war was the youth underground organization Young Guards, created in 1942 in the city of Krasnodar, Donetsk region. Despite the fact that some journalists today suggest the insignificance of the contribution of this organization, in fact, this is not so. Teenagers, boys and girls put up flyers that told about the situation on the fronts, collected weapons, which were then handed over to partisans, helped captured Red Army soldiers get out of captivity, and so on. It is known that members of the Young Guard burned the occupational labor exchange, thanks to which only about 2,500 Red Army soldiers did not end up in Hitler's so-called labor concentration camps. Underground workers poisoned and burned grain, which was intended to be sent to Germany, recaptured a herd of more than 500 heads, and dispersed it through the surrounding villages and farms. In other words, the young people created a lot of problems for the occupiers. Unfortunately, on January 1, 1943, the backbone of the organization, the commander, deputy, and commissar were arrested. The headquarters immediately decided that the Young Guard should urgently leave the city. But the orders were not carried out. Only 12 people managed to avoid arrest. The rest did not really know what to do. Someone was worried and afraid for their parents, whom the occupiers could arrest and execute. Someone was going to free the leaders of the underground organization. Ultimately, this led to the fact that almost all members of the Young Guard were arrested. All the prison cells were overcrowded. And in order to drown out the screams of the tormented teenagers, the chief of police turned the gramophone at full volume. What the young people had to endure is impossible to even imagine. They were tortured with rare brutality and cruelty. Girls were hung by hair until their hair was torn off. Underground fighters had their fingers crushed by doors. Needles were driven under their fingernails, or they were torn off. Executioners often imitated hanging by putting a noose around the neck and pulling it through a hook driven into the wall. During torture, many had stars cut and burned on their chest and backs. Some were put in a hot stove. Many had their arms and legs cut off. The punishers gouged out or burned out their eyes, cut off their ears and noses, and broke bones. And with all this, the guys were constantly beaten with whips, rubber truncheons, or metal sticks. By torture, the underground members were brought to such a state that, for example, the leader of the organization, Tretyakov, after exhumation, was identified only by his clothes, as well as many others. Already after the liberation of the city, the investigators managed to restore the picture of what the punishers were doing with the detained and arrested partisans. For example, Maya Pelikbanova withstood the torture, which did not stop for almost 4 days. The girl was first severely beaten, then her legs were broken and her eyes gouged out, after which, deciding that this was not enough, the executioners cut off Maya's chest. According to eyewitnesses, she could not walk from the beatings, and she was carried to the place of execution in arms. 19-year-old Ulyana Gromova, like Maya, survived a real hell. She had a star carved on her chest. Her left arm was broken in several places. The executioners inflicted several wounds on her body with a red-hot iron, which were then sprinkled with salt. The girl was set on a hot stove and held until she lost consciousness from pain. Ulyana was hung from the ceiling by braids. Lyubov Shvitsova's executioners carved several stars on her body at once, and the punishers disfigured her face by firing an explosive bullet almost point blank. Lyubov, along with 4 other underground workers, was shot, but before the execution she endured inhumane torture for almost a month. The partisans who were executed with her also went through hell. During the torture, the executioners crushed Semyon Ostapенko's skull with a gun buttstock. Oleg Koshevoy was mutilated with blows and had his eye gouged out. The Nazis pierced his cheek with a bayonet and crushed the back of his head. By the way, the hair on the guy's head was completely gray. And the punishers twisted all the joints of Viktor Subotin on an analog of a medieval rack. The recollection of one of the participants in the interrogation of 17-year-old Sergei Tulenin, who was allegedly beaten to death during torture, testified to the fact that Nazis went berserk from the stamina of the young underground workers. He was unrecognizable German, like an angry tiger with forged German boots. He stuck with terrible force. At first, Tulenin showed signs of life, but soon he fell silent and he was dragged out of the office. The executioners cut off Simosina's hands, carved a star on her cheek, and twisted her arms. And Yevgeny Shepilov had his stomach pulled out. Then the Nazi cut off his hands and crushed his head. Presumably, the young man died during the torture, and his already dead body was thrown into the pit. Vladimir Zhdanov had 2 strips of skin cut out on his back, and his fingers were broken. His eyes were gouged out and his ears were cut off. 17-year-old Claudia Kovaleva was burned by the executioners. Her feet were cut off. Her right arm and right breast were cut off. During interrogation, Nikolai Barakov's heels were cut off, and his teeth and his left eye were knocked out. The executioner, enraged by his silence, broke all his limbs, cut off his right hand, and then pulled out his tongue. Bondareva Alexandra, in addition to all the inhumane bullying, the executioners cut off her head. During torture, the Germans flattened Nina Gerasimov's head. Her parents managed to identify her daughter only by the marks on her body. Practically the same fate befell Alexandra Dubrovin and Lilia Ivanihin, who were beheaded during interrogations. The executioners chopped off Dmitry Zhukov's hand and foot and pulled out Vladimir Zagoruiko's hair. Dmitry Lukashenko's eyes were burned out during torture. His hand was cut off and his nose was cut off. Anatoly Popov's fingers were smashed, and then his left foot was cut off, and Vladimir Rogozhin's executioners had all his teeth knocked out, his eyes gouged out, and his spine broken. This list is endless. What young boys and girls experience during torture is beyond human perception. Again, many parents were not able to recognize their children and identify them only by items of clothing or marks on the body. The execution of members of the Young Guard began on January 15, 1943. The first group was thrown into a pit about 50 meters deep. The executioners dumped the bodies of both tortured and living underground workers. It is known that Viktor Tretyakov, who remained alive by some incomprehensible miracle, even tried grabbing a policeman, deputy head of the city police, to throw into the pit with him. The second policeman helped the traitor, hitting Viktor on the head with a pistol. After the first group was thrown into the pit, the next day the Nazis shot the second group, and the third on the last day of January. The invaders executed the remaining 4 underground workers already in the city of Ravensky on February 9, 1943. However, the torture did not end there. When Krasnodon was liberated by Red Army units, torment began for parents who gathered at the pit, trying to find and identify their children. What they went through is hard to imagine, despite the fact that the process of extracting the remains was quite difficult and dangerous. The parents were constantly at the place of execution. They wanted only one thing: to find the bodies of their sons and daughters. For example, the father of Lydia Androsova told one of the mothers of the deceased underground worker, "But I have to find her. It is not such an impossible task to manage the extraction. I have been working in the mine for 20 years. I have a lot of experience. I will go to the city committee of the party. I will ask permission to lead the extraction." And the next day, having received permission, Androsov set to work. During the extraction of the bodies, it turned out that the Nazis were trying to hide the traces of the execution by throwing stones and trolleys into the pit. According to the recollections of local residents, for several more days, groans were heard from the pit. And the rescuers who removed the bodies later told investigators that they had found many outside of the pit. During the execution, the young people, while still alive, tried to crawl a little to the side. Presumably, at least half of those executed on January 15th were thrown alive, but no one is completely sure of this. The only underground worker who managed to avoid execution, Kovalev, unfortunately is considered missing. His fate is unknown.